Hello, thank you very much. My name is David Hill, and I'm a PI at the Medical Research Council, and my research focuses on genetic links between cognitive ability and socioeconomic status, and what this means for our health. So first, I'd like to say exactly what it is that I mean when I say cognitive ability. So cognitive ability is often known under a few different synonyms, be it intelligence, cognitive performance, cognitive functioning, mental ability, or even IQ. However, when cognitive ability is usually measured using different tests of cognitive ability, of which there are many thousands, be it numerical tests, logical reasoning tests, or pattern-type tests. So this can hand the cynic into the idea that there are as many different cognitive abilities as there are tests of cognitive ability. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with something like this, where we have spatial ability, interpersonal ability, and these are often described as being quite separate constructs. However, this doesn't seem to be the case of what we know from the data. In a very early finding by Charles Spearman, who analyzed school grades of children, what he found was that the better a child does at something like mathematics, the better they tend to do at English literature, or French, or maths. And so this indicates the presence of something that is common across different tests of cognitive ability. G indicating what's general, and S, 1, 2, and 3 indicating specific tests of cognitive ability. And so from this, nearly 100 years later, we go to Carroll's three-stratum model, and this is analyzing over 400 different data sets on a broad range of cognitive ability type tests. And what was found and replicated very well was the idea that these tests positively correlated with each other, again, indicating that the better you do at tests of mathematics or tests at reasoning, the better you do at vocabulary type tests or tests of general knowledge or education in general. However, tests that were more similar in nature correlated more strongly, giving rise to these second-level domains, be it verbal tests, verbal abilities, which correlate more strongly with verbal tests, a speed domain, which correlates more strongly with speed tests, and going on into end domains, depending on what you put in. And so we end up with this three-level model, which explains why people do differently at tests of cognitive ability, which is because they're better at them in general, they're better at a specific domain, and they can do very well at certain specific tests as well. And so the next question that arises from something like this is, well, is this general factor measured by the test, or is it produced by it? And so when we create these general factors of cognitive ability using a diverse battery of cognitive tests, we create these general factors at the top here, here, and here. The squares indicate separate tests, and each G factor here is configured, loaded using separate tests. So using each of these tests, we derive one G factor. In the same people, these tests derive a G factor, and in all of these tests to derive a G factor. And what we find is that the correlation between the general factors is around 1 across many different factors that can be made. And so this is very similar to measuring height in feet and measuring height in centimeters. Yes, you get two different numbers, but that's not because you've measured two different things. You've used two different tools to get a measure of the same thing. So why should anyone care about measuring cognitive ability? It's just a number on a test. It doesn't predict anything. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it actually does predict something. And the field of cognitive epidemiology, which developed in the early 2000s, shows this very well, whereby intelligence tests taken in childhood and young adulthood are linked to health differences later in life. And there's a great review article here as well on this that I can only recommend very highly. And so cognitive ability is highly predictive of all-cause mortality across longitudinal data and very long follow-up periods. So across these 4 studies here, you'll notice that the follow-up times are between 19 years and about 68 years. So these are individuals that have their cognitive ability gauged in childhood and young adulthood and are followed up for a large portion of their lives. In the case of this study here, the Murray House test, this comes from the Lothian birth cohorts in Scotland. So Scotland's quite unique with regards to cognitive epidemiology and cognitive epidemiology data because every 11-year-old in Scotland was IQ tested, not once, but twice. And these are two separate groups of 11-year-olds, and this took place in the early 1900s, and they were followed up 70 years later, with the idea of being able to show or ascertain if these cognitive ability tests taken in childhood were predictive of their future health and future mental health. So in this instance, it was predicting longevity over the 68-year period. Cognitive ability is also predictive of things related to socioeconomic status, such as educational attainment, somewhat unsurprisingly, and also intelligence is one of the best individual predictors of job success and on-the-job performance. And we have some evidence from one of my own previous studies that intelligence is one of the many causal factors in income differences within the UK. Moreover, turning to mental health, the idea that cognitive ability is some measure that is also predictive of your mental health, where a 1 standard deviation lower measure of intelligence is associated with a 50% increase in hospitalization for schizophrenia, mood disorder, and alcohol-related disorders. And also a high level of intelligence in childhood is predictive of a lower level of self-reported psychological distress. So in the case of the first, we see signs of mental illness, the pathological, something that would require a professional. In the second instance, these are individuals that have not been hospitalized but report less satisfaction with their lives. So cognitive ability is something we can measure using different tests, and we can measure it well and accurately, and it seems to predict both physical and mental health. This is good cause to try and understand the causes of differences in cognitive ability. And what we've started to look at, or what we've looked at, are the genetic etiology of cognitive ability. So this is built on the finding that cognitive ability is heritable. And a quick mention here of what heritability is just the proportion of variation in a population that's attributable to additive genetic effects. Importantly, heritability is not evidence of genetic determinism. It's not evidence that the role of the environment doesn't matter. It's not indicative that any one gene will solve all the problems or be a gene of large effect, and nor is it evidence that genes do or don't matter for a trait. It's simply a proportion of variance. So to understand the heritability of cognitive ability, we can look at behavioral genetic methods that use twin or family data, or more recently, molecular genetic data. And in both these instances, they're asking the same question, they're just using different methods. And the question is, to what difference does genetic similarity predict phenotypic similarity? In the case of behavioral genetics, where identical twins are used, if there is a genetic effect on the trait, then identical twins should be more similar than non-identical dizygotic twins. In the population with the molecular genetic methods, we don't use related individuals, but we use unrelated individuals. However, we can calculate the degree to which they share genes. They are in some way related, being part of the same species. And in this non-family group, we can ask the question of, does genetic similarity predict phenotypic similarity? And when we do this with cognitive ability, a good sample for this we've used here is Generation Scotland, what we find is intelligence is around 50% heritable, whereas with common genotyped variants explain around just over 20% of the variation, and rare variation that won't be captured by a genome-wide association study seems to explain the bulk of the heritable variation, with it being approximately 30%, to take the total heritability at just over 50. So what we want to do is identify genes that are associated with cognitive ability. We know that it's heritable, and we know that it's worth predicting. The early designs we used were candidate gene designs, which I'm sure people are familiar with here, where you hypothesize a certain biological system, substrate, mechanism by which genetic variation would result in phenotypic variation. My own extremely charitable interpretation of this, that most genetic associations with general intelligence are probably false. That's absolutely true when this came out. The figure here illustrates the effect sizes one can expect for the candidate gene designs, and these are those that have significant effects in candidate gene designs, replicated or attempted to in a large genome-wide association study. There's nothing. My own generous interpretation here is this is a good thing. It shows that there's no genes of large effect. So make of that what you will. So turning from this, we go to genome-wide association studies. These differ in their logic from the candidate gene design, as we're now not focusing on any one specific variant, but rather we're looking across the genome for any sign that specific genetic variants may be associated with a trait. So in a genome-wide association study, we're taking common single nucleotide polymorphisms, which is a small subset of the genome, and testing for association using linear models, such as that illustrated here, where we're simply using a linear effect of calculating the number of T alleles to see if between the homozygous C, heterozygous CT/TC, or homozygous T groups, there is this linear trend or an effect at all. Genome-wide association studies won't pinpoint the variant that's driving any association, but rather they'll highlight the region. This is an important caveat to the design as well, where if we have our measured genetic variant and all the variants in linkage disequilibrium or correlated with our variant, we might have an association that turns out to be the causal SNP. This doesn't seem to occur, but rather we measure a multitude of SNPs that are correlated in some way. So we won't ever end up with a single variant, we'll end up with a region of association. So the first large genome-wide association study on cognitive ability was carried out by myself in 2018 and published in 2019. This illustrates the results of our genome-wide association study. On the x-axis here are the chromosomes labeled 1 to 22. On the y-axis, the minus log 10 of the p-value of the association. This red line here illustrates statistical significance, so anything above the line is statistically significant. Each dot indicates one single nucleotide polymorphism, the statistical unit of association in a genome-wide association study, of which there are about 11 million here. There are 187 independent associations with this, and there are a bulk of downstream biological analyses we did as well. But what I want to talk to you about is the shared genetic etiology across traits and focusing on some of the mental health traits that we have. So this heat map here describes genetic correlations with the trait of interest that we have, cognitive ability, and on the x-axis, a number of other GWAS performed on other phenotypes. The color indicates whether it's a positive or a negative genetic correlation, and a genetic correlation describes the average shared genetic effect between a pair of traits. So a positive genetic correlation would indicate that genetic variants that facilitate cognitive ability also facilitate lung capacity, autism spectrum disorder, and anorexia nervosa. So in this instance, genetic variants that are involved in higher levels of cognitive ability are also a risk factor for certain psychiatric disorders. So intelligence, not always a good thing, at least genetically. However, it's also true that in some instances, the genetic variants that facilitate cognitive ability, facilitate intelligence, are also protective against traits we see there, such as schizophrenia, ADHD particularly, coronary artery disease, and Alzheimer's disease as well. So this is indicating that genetic variants that are associated with one trait might also be protective and risk factors for other. So when we've got this evidence of genetic correlations between traits, what we have evidence of are genetic effects that are shared between pairs of traits. And this can occur for two primary reasons. We have horizontal pleiotropy or vertical pleiotropy. And pleiotropy is describing these shared genetic effects. So on this schematic that I have here, G is for a genetic variant, T is for a trait, and RG is the genetic correlation. So in cases of horizontal pleiotropy, we have one genetic variant that has an independent effect on two different traits. And this will induce a non-zero genetic correlation between the two traits. We can have also instances of horizontal pleiotropy where one genetic variant influences a third trait, which is a causal factor in two traits. And this again will introduce a non-zero genetic correlation. Or we can have instances of vertical pleiotropy. And vertical pleiotropy describes instances where one phenotype, one trait, is causal in a second trait. So any genetic variant that's causal in trait 1 will be causal in trait 2, not because there's a genetic effect of the trait, but because the trait itself that is heritable is the causal factor. And so this is what gives rise to genetic findings for traits such as poverty, income, and educational attainment. There's often the statement that these are, how can these be heritable traits? They're not biological, and that they're measures of the environment. Well, I completely agree. There are no, in my opinion, any direct genetic effects on socioeconomic status. Rather, heritable traits are, in some way, causal factors themselves. So when we run our genome-wide association study on something such as education, this is what we're doing. We're ascertaining the genetic variation that's associated with the social science construct. However, this link can only exist because we're capturing genetic variation that's linked to health, genetic variation that's linked to cognitive ability, or genetic variation that's linked to personality. And these themselves are the causal factors in socioscience variables. And it's this vertical pleiotropy that gives rise to the heritability of social science traits. Mental health traits, psychiatric traits, and substance abuse disorders are also heritable traits. And this figure comes from an essay written by Abdul Abdullawi, published, I think it was earlier this year. And what he's stating here is that we have a wealth of findings for our genome-wide association studies on psychiatric disorders, as well as mood disorders and substance abuse disorders, as well as high heritabilities in some instances of some of these cases as well. And as with cognitive ability, here labeled intelligence, we have strong genetic correlations between measures of psychiatric disorders. And psychiatric disorders show genetic correlations with cognitive ability, educational attainment, and income. These genetic correlations are negative on this, broadly negative, indicating that genetic variation that's predictive of psychiatric disorders is also an inhibitory factor for educational attainment and income. So we've got these shared genetic effects that exist between psychiatric disorders and socioeconomic status. So what happens if we try and remove these? So what this figure illustrates from Mares et al. Are the disorders on the previous page: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, bipolar, and others. And when we look at the total genetic effect, the total heritability of these, for something like ADHD, the total heritability is just under 30%. I'm going to call that 28%. But once we remove the genetic effects that are linked to differences in socioeconomic status, the genetic differences that explain ADHD decrease. The heritability goes down once we remove the effects of socioeconomic status. We see similar effects on this as well for the quantity of alcohol consumed, as well as anxiety disorder, and to a lesser extent, smoking cessation. And so, whilst there are genetic correlations between psychiatric disorders, these also are in some way mediated by socioeconomic status. Where if we look at ADHD, we have the frequency that one drinks alcohol is correlated with ADHD, such that higher levels of ADHD are correlated with higher levels, or genetically correlated with the frequency in which one consumes alcohol. However, once you control for the genetic effects of socioeconomic status, the genetic effects that increase ADHD protect against alcohol consumption, indicating that the effects aren't coming from ADHD, but they're coming from socioeconomic status, which may be a causal factor in some of these, but I'll come back to that. Similar findings as well for major depressive disorder, where once one controls for the genetic effects linked to socioeconomic status, there's fewer genetic links between major depressive disorder and other psychiatric and drug-taking disorders. We see similar things as well for schizophrenia, where there's a significant reduction in the genetic correlation between schizophrenia and smoking, as well as alcohol frequency, again indicating this genetic overlap between psychiatric disorders and socioeconomic status type traits. So in order to investigate differences, differences linked to socioeconomic status and psychiatric variables, we can use another tool that we have, rather than look at the average genetic effect across two pairs of traits, we can calculate the degree to which one individual has a genetic load for a trait, something we call a polygenic score. And what a polygenic score is an individual level measure where each individual gets a single number describing their genetic propensity towards trait X, be it schizophrenia, education, cognitive ability, height, weight, you name it. And we can derive these for our participants in our group, and we can come up with, and it produces a normally distributed variable of genetic liability towards risk. And what's quite interesting is if we do this for educational attainment, and we can combine these with the large data sets we have, such as UK Biobank, illustrated here in another paper by Abdullawi from 2019, we have a non-equal geographical distribution for the genetic load of education. However, beyond this, it's not a standing finding. What it is predictive of migration across the UK. So you'll notice here it's born outside of a coal mining region or born in a coal mining region. And we have the dates in which participants were born across the x-axis here, coal burns, across the x-axis here. And so the finding is here that individuals with a higher polygenic load for education are more likely to move away from environments of high risk, such as former coal mining areas. By high risk, I mean areas of lower socioeconomic status with fewer opportunities, the jobs that are more hazardous, more pollution, and this sort of thing. So we end up with these gene-environment correlations, whereby if you have a higher polygenic load for education, you can move away from regions of risk. So I mentioned before about this vertical pleiotropy and horizontal pleiotropy. We can use techniques such as Mendelian randomization to try and look for causality between pairs of traits. That is to say, we can make statements where the links between our traits are due to vertical pleiotropy rather than horizontal pleiotropy. We can use Mendelian randomization if we can satisfy three assumptions that we have here. So this schematic lays out the logic of a Mendelian randomization study, where G is a genetic variant, and we want to understand whether one trait, T1 in this instance, is a causal factor in T2, trait 2. C illustrates confounders, something associated with both. So in order to establish if T1 is causal of T2, we will need something, genetic factors in this instance, that are associated with trait 1 and not independent. So we use our genetic variants as an instrumental variable, a substitute for a trait. We want our genetic variants to ensure that these are independent and free of any confounds that might explain our results. And we want to make sure the genetic variants that we have are associated with T2 only through T1. That is to say, a genetic variant can't be independently associated with this. We need to make sure it goes through T1. And so using Mendelian randomization, we can use genetic variants as these instrumental variables. And in doing so, we can add an element of randomization to our studies, whereby rather than randomly allocating a participant to a control or a treatment group, during conception, we have the random segregation of alleles to our participants. And so we can use effect alleles and non-effect alleles from a genome-wide association study as these instrumental variables. So we're randomly allocating, essentially, alleles to participants rather than randomly allocating a participant to a control or a treatment group. And so this is what's been done in a study with a fine collaborator of mine, looking at to see if poverty is one of the potentially causal factors in differences in mental health. So this is a genome-wide association study on poverty, and I believe the effective sample size is around 600,000 participants here, from which 99 loci can be used as these instrumental variables, and we're following the logic laid out on the last slide here. Using these genetic variants associated with one trait, are they causal for the second? And so in the figure here, what we're trying to ascertain is, does our genome-wide association study significant loci for poverty? are they causally associated with differences in mental health? And as indicated here, higher level of poverty is one of the causal factors for ADHD, one of the protective factors against anorexia, and a causal factor for anxiety disorders. And also, an equally important question is, does mental illness cause differences in poverty? So going from this, we can look at the opposite sorts of effects, whereby ADHD is one of the causal factors towards differences in poverty. What is that? And bipolar disorder is one of the factors that's protective against differences in poverty. So we can use these genome-wide association studies on socioeconomic status type variables to look at psychiatric disorders. We can also use them to try and look at differences in the structure of the brain. And this is what I've tried to do in one of my studies recently as well, where we're looking at differences in socioeconomic status to ascertain if it's causal in differences in brain structure, and whether brain structure has causal relationship with different aspects of socioeconomic status. And what we see is that socioeconomic status causes differences in white matter hyperintensities, which are a marker of brain aging. So brains seem to age more rapidly in lower socioeconomic status type statements. And also, total brain volume is one of the causal factors in differences in socioeconomic status. When looking at each factor, each different indicator of socioeconomic status, it doesn't seem to matter which ones you choose, be it occupation, income, or anything else. The results stay consistent, whereby these differences are causal in differences in white matter hyperintensities, and total brain volume is one of the causal factors in differences in socioeconomic status. So what we wanted to try and understand from this point is whether or not these differences in socioeconomic status were entirely dependent on differences in cognitive ability. Because as I mentioned before, there's going to be no direct effect on socioeconomic status itself, no direct genetic effect, but rather we're going to be capturing some sort of intermediate heritable trait. And so what we first did is we plotted the overlapping causal loci for cognitive ability onto our different measures of socioeconomic status, be it a general factor of socioeconomic status, or educational attainment, social deprivation, occupational prestige, or household income. The colour on the left-hand side, the blue that is to say, is indicative of loci that are unique to cognitive ability. The orange are loci that are unique to any measure of socioeconomic status, whereas the grey indicates the overlap. And something to take from this is that there are no unique cognitive ability loci. There's no good evidence for them anyway. So if you measure socioeconomic status, you are measuring cognitive ability genetically. However, the reverse isn't true. If you measure cognitive ability, you are not measuring socioeconomic status. There are unique elements to socioeconomic status that are not dependent on cognitive ability, indicating that socioeconomic status, whilst genetically similar to cognitive ability, isn't the whole story. There's some other heritable trait going on there. Cognitive ability is also one of the causal factors we identified for each of our measures of socioeconomic status. And again, socioeconomic status is one of the causal factors in cognitive ability. Going back to Matthias' study on poverty, when he wanted to try and understand if his effects were simply due to differences in cognitive ability, what he found was the answer was largely no. They're not solely due to cognitive ability, but the effect of cognitive ability is still present. That is to say, poverty has a causal effect on ADHD, as does cognitive ability. By controlling for cognitive ability, you don't remove the effect of poverty, and by controlling for poverty, you don't remove the effect of cognitive ability. For some of the effects, however, for anxiety disorders, I think there's less evidence for poverty, although it's still significant. But in the case of autism spectrum disorder, poverty is not a causal factor. It's only due to cognitive ability in this instance. When going back to the structure of the brain and asking the question as well, was that just cognitive ability? What we find is the answer is again no. The effect of socioeconomic status on white matter hyperintensity, this measure of brain aging, is still present even once the effect of cognitive ability is removed. However, in this instance, there's no effect of cognitive ability once controlling for socioeconomic status. And so some conclusions of this. So for the genetic relationship between cognitive ability and socioeconomic status is quite a fascinating one. Socioeconomic status is a heritable trait, and it largely seems to draw upon genetic differences in cognitive ability. However, there are genetic differences due to, in SES that are not due to cognitive ability, indicating that heritable traits such as differences in health, differences in personality, or other traits seem to be predictive of socioeconomic status. And also, in some way, this we illustrate the use of genetic data can better understand the role of the environment. So using these measures, genome-wide association studies on education, on poverty, on income, we can try and make causal statements on whether or not differences in income are causally associated with these differences in psychiatric and other health variables. So in this way, we can start to introduce the element of randomization to go beyond an association with traits and to get closer to causality. And also important to note that SES isn't just cognitive ability, it captures a constellation of heritable traits, of which cognitive ability seems to be one, albeit quite important, component. So, thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge my master's students who did a lot of this work, as well as my collaborators and Mark. Thank you.